Our story begins during the time of the 30 Years' War in Europe, a devastating conflict that began with the deposing of Ferdinand II, the Holy Roman Emperor and King of Bohemia, Hungary and Croatia, by Czech Protestants, who installed the Calvinist Frederick V as King of Bohemia instead. Poor old Frederick was under the illusion that the Protestant union he was currently leader of would support his acceptance of the Bohemian crown, and he also counted on the backing of his father-in-law James of both Scotland and England. But both the Union and King James were against the move, with Frederick being left high and dry, while the imperial army quickly moved in and crushed the Bohemian rebels. Frederick absconded to his uncle's protection in the Dutch Republic and remained in exile for the rest of his life, earning the unfortunate nickname the Winter King, while Emperor Ferdinand unceremoniously confiscated many of his German holdings and distributed his titles to other princes. But that's when the problems really began. You see, it was all well and good to restore the rightful heir to his throne, even a Catholic one, but when the imperial army moved into Frederick's estates in the north of the German Palatinate, suddenly the other local Protestant statelets panicked that the treaties they had signed guaranteeing their religious freedom and security 70-odd years ago would be torn up by the empire, and it would use the Bohemian revolt as a pretext to make a move on them as well. It was all the messier because outside Protestant realms, such as Sweden and Denmark, had holdings within the Protestant estates of the empire, while others, who were Catholic, had Protestant concentrations within their own border regions, and they were concerned that these might break off and join their brethren. To top it off, the status quo within the Holy Roman Empire was occasionally rocked by a Catholic territory or city becoming Protestant, which would trigger a sectarian war, such as happened in Cologne in 1588. Moreover, Dutch Protestant rebels who had fought their way to a Mexican, or should I say Spanish, standoff with Habsburg Spain currently had a 12-year truce in place that was just about to expire, and were both keen to get their gloves on again. France, meanwhile, still shirty about Spain not sharing the spoils of Latin America and eyeing off the significant impact that any internal conflict would have on Habsburg power, for the time being, nevertheless played its cards close to its chest. Things were already on edge with the War of the Jülich Succession in 1609, which involved a couple of duchies in the Rhineland whose ruler had recently died without an heir. The Holy Roman Emperor had pretensions of annexing the territory, but so did the Spanish, who viewed the lands as a potential springboard to attack the Netherlands, who in turn were desperate to prevent this from happening. France, again, though nominally neutral, was concerned that any Habsburg expansion into its north was a threat to its own interests, and in any case, they were all for both the Spanish and the Holy Roman Empire slogging it out in a war against their own Protestants that would reduce their power and influence on the continent. So it was that, despite their being Catholic, French sympathies were quietly with the Protestants, despite their own ongoing brutal persecution of the Huguenot population within France. Confusing? Hang on to your bratwurst, because we're just getting started. So, by the early 17th century, the Holy Roman Empire was a religious powder keg just primed to go off. And go off it did, when in 1620 the Spanish moved in to secure the south of the deposed Frederick's Palatinate region. King James, over in Britain, finally responded to this direct attack on his son-in-law's possessions by threatening Spanish interests in the Americas with the Royal Navy. Protestant duchies within the empire now moved to repel the Spanish, only to be set upon by the emperor's forces, who were backing the Catholics. The Spanish, however, were really only interested in the west of the continent and tried to avoid getting sucked into the empire's broader problems, because when in 1621 the Dutch-Spanish truce expired, they turned all their attention to the Netherlands, as expected, and the slugfest was now on for young and old. The Dutch and English sent in troops to support the Protestants, but their efforts in the early years of the war were poorly coordinated, and they suffered some serious defeats. By 1625, the Catholics were getting the upper hand, so Denmark and Sweden joined in the fray, mostly to preserve their own continental holdings, but also to see if they could squeeze out a few more German duchies for themselves in the process. Over the next decade, Protestants would claw their way back, and the Spanish were forced to divert some of their armies from their own private war with the Dutch back over to the east to help out the floundering empire at its back. By 1635, the Swedes, who were by now making some serious inroads, were finally checked by the Spanish intervention, which funneled troops and supplies northwards from their Italian holdings, as well as across from their Dutch ones. This whole time, the wily French were funneling both cash and intelligence to the insurgent Protestants, but when the Swedes began taking some serious losses, France finally mobilized its army in 1636 and sent 35,000 troops in support of them, cutting off Spanish supply lines from Italy and reinforcing Dutch positions in the north. When French progress in Flanders and Alsace began weakening the Spanish campaign in the Netherlands, and Dutch naval victories at sea caused civil unrest in Portugal, which was then in an uncomfortable union with Spain, the writing was on the wall for the Spanish, and negotiations with the Dutch began for a ceasefire. The Emperor over in Deutschland kept things going, however, and severe losses were now being taken on all sides as the conflict moved from the periphery of the theatre to the heartlands of the empire. But by 1644, pressure was mounting on the Holy Roman Empire to call for a treaty, with the Swedes, thanks to French support, once again picking up momentum and pushing all the way to Prague, while the French attacked Spanish possessions in Italy, both directly and indirectly through supporting armed revolts from within. Now, in case you're not confused enough, the French under Cardinal Richelieu and later Cardinal Mazarin were doing quite well seizing territory from their fellow Catholic kingdoms and, if you recall, financing Protestant states such as the Dutch Republic and Sweden. But the skullduggery went both ways, you see, because the Catholic Germans, Austrians, and the Spanish were themselves financing and aiding Protestant Huguenot insurgents all throughout France. So let's just pause for a moment to take this all in. An internal conflict that basically started because a Catholic monarch was replaced with a Protestant one, which was actually internally repudiated by other internal Protestants, suddenly flipped when external Catholics piled in. All the Protestants now changed their mind and were then aided by a number of other invading external Protestants, all looking to cash in on the action. Meanwhile, scheming external Catholics, who were supposedly neutral, were nevertheless undermining their own brethren for personal gain as well, by supporting the internal Protestants against them, while internal Catholics were likewise financing external Protestants to fight back against their external Catholic brethren who were allied to other external Protestants. Confused? Welcome to international politics. And to think that, despite this Machiavellian lunacy, where Catholic cardinals were supporting Protestant princes against other Catholics, ordinary Christian folk to this very day still engage in sectarian violence and mutual hatred. Aren't we all a bunch of suckers? Thankfully, everyone eventually ran out of money, and when the party was over, the French were left with some juicy parcels of land in Flanders, the Rhine region, and northern Italy in the Treaty of Westphalia in 1648. Score! But the Spanish, despite their treaty with the Scandinavians and the Dutch Republic, were still at war with France, and their conflict raged on sporadically and inconclusively for a number of years more, with both sides lacking the cash to make any big moves. And this is where our story comes back home to France. Young King Louis XIV was still a minor, and under the regency and protection of warrior Cardinals Richelieu and later Mazarin. His father, Louis XIII, and Chief Minister Richelieu were formidable proponents of absolutism, which basically entailed stripping the nobility of their feudal privileges and autonomy, and creating a strong, centralised state, heavily vesting its power with the monarch. In doing so, they increased their state revenue, which in turn allowed them to expand their colonial holdings in Canada, as well as modernise and coordinate the army into a unified fighting force capable of quickly responding to both outside as well as internal threats. Their brutal suppression of Protestants at home flew in the face of their alliances with states such as England, the Dutch, and the Swedes, but greater problems were to beset them when their own nobles rose up against them. Richelieu's political machinations and influence over the king were starting to earn him plenty of enemies, but he had by now developed a superb spy network that was the Gestapo of its day. His cunning and ruthless grip on power behind the throne has been immortalized by writers such as Dumas and its various Hollywood period pieces. Anyway, both the good Cardinal and Louis XIII fell off the perch before the 30 Years' War was over, with Richelieu's protégé, Cardinal Mazarin, taking over the reins of both the French war effort as well as the guardianship of young Louis XIV, alongside Louis's mother, Anne of Austria. Yes, another Catholic, presiding over the French wars in her own motherland. Mazarin and the Queen continued the hardline policy of absolute rule, and the young Louis would grow to inherit his father's zeal for making the entire country all about himself. And boy, did he ever. But we're getting ahead of ourselves. So, by the conclusion of the 30 Years' War, we now have a France that, in relation to its devastated neighbours, has significantly strengthened its geopolitical position to become the dominant player in continental affairs. But, as mentioned, internally, France was at a flashpoint. You see, the nobility, whose expensive obligations to supply the crown's war effort in men and material saw them return home as heroes, only to be suddenly hit with huge unexpected tax bills and restrictions in revenue as the war with Spain continued to drag on. The furious nobles, who once upon a time were exempted from such taxes, were soon joined by the bourgeoisie, that is to say, occupants of free royal cities, who were now also stripped of their feudal tax exemptions and bore the brunt of the royal cash grab. Anger at this affront to their ancient liberties fueled first a legal dispute in the French law courts, known as Parlement, and then an outright rebellion that is known today as the Fronde. Spain took advantage of this discontent and fueled the civil war with cash and supplies, such that the French got a serious dose of karma, while Spain finally managed to make some progress in the overall war by supporting the rebellious French princes with their own troops. Princes, it should be said, they had recently themselves been fighting against in the 30 Years' War. The disgruntled French nobles, now very unnobly, set about plundering their own countryside far and wide, with bands of unruly soldiers who were little more than brigands. The whole situation got so bad that Oliver Cromwell, over in Old Blighty, sent his new model army across the Channel to help the Royalist forces out, and took Dunkirk as a prize for his trouble. Now, let's just get this straight. A Protestant dictator in England, who had not that long ago lopped the head off his own monarch and was busy massacring Catholics from Dover to Dublin, was now sending Protestant English anti-monarch parliamentary troops over the pond to help a Catholic French royalist army because, well, they hated the Spanish even more than the French. I told you this was crazy. Unsurprisingly, the entire populace was getting fed up with the chaos caused by marauding homegrown princes and their Spanish backers, and began yearning for a strong hand to return peace to the country, even rising up against occupying forces and, unexpectedly, putting up stiff resistance to sieges that should have been easy pickings for the rebels. The result was that by 1653, Royalist forces had not only suppressed the Fronde Rebellion, but had completely crushed it, and though the Franco-Spanish War would drag on until 1659, ending in more or less a stalemate, Spain had by now bankrupted twice, and its fortunes as a major power in Europe began to permanently contract from this point on. Part of the peace settlement involved a return of exiled rebel aristocrats to France and a royal marriage between the two crowns, which would eventually become a poisoned chalice for France. As young Louis XIV finally came of age to be crowned, he and his fighting cardinal vowed never to let French aristocrats get anywhere near capable of ever pulling a stunt like the Fronde again. So, he built a massive new imperial complex at Versailles and had all the nobles and the entire court move there, where they would be under strict control and supervision by his agents. Welcome to the era of French absolute monarchy and the rule of the mighty Sun King. It was a time of paranoid megalomania, political wheeling and dealing and intrigue, in which you could fall out of favour with the monarch or the church on the basis of merely a rumour and lose your head for a casual comment or perceived insult. The aristocracy was on edge and nervous to please the king, throwing each other under the proverbial bus to win his favour, while the church, who backed him, used its powerful influence to prevent any kind of religious dissent. But the king's aggressive foreign policy and propensity to go to war at the least pretext eventually began to drain the country's otherwise vast resources. France had managed to avoid the devastation that affected the rest of Europe during both the 30 Years' War and ongoing Ottoman incursions, and its population was now the largest in Europe. But his ongoing international belligerence, excessive spending and extravagant, isolated lifestyle had begun to make him increasingly unpopular in the provinces, and by the early 1700s, virtually every kingdom in Europe was also plotting against him. This didn't go unnoticed, and underground circles began publishing inflammatory polemics against the government in greater number, while the nobility and bourgeoisie, now long used to clandestine intrigue, circulated the material with scandalous relish. Such pamphlets and books prompted endless police raids, arrests, and gruesome executions, so, unsurprisingly, most authors remained as anonymous as possible, typically relying on pseudonyms and denial to avoid the noose. In 1715, the sun finally set on the once mighty Sun King, to be followed soon after by the unfortunate deaths of a succession of his direct heirs, including the Dauphin and Dauphin Jr., with the mood in Paris now changing considerably, and by that I don't mean grief. You see, in the final decade of his reign, Louis XIV had become increasingly pious and melancholy, largely thanks to his last mistress, who was a hardcore Catholic and who convinced him to repent his sinful ways. Consequently, the tolerance for, shall we say, ungodly behaviour tanked, and the once flamboyant king of parties decidedly became the king of party poopers, with a concomitant crackdown on his unruly and unrepentant subjects. As the next in line, the future Louis XV was himself now still a child, the country was governed by a regent, his uncle, the Duke of Orleans. Now, the Duke was never meant to be in the running for such a heavy responsibility, and was casually raised in the midst of all the debauchery, excess, and indulgence of the periphery of the court. So, when by the peculiar winds of fate he became regent for his nephew, the Duke scrapped all his predecessor's stuffy conservative reforms, released all the riffraff from the Bastille, and turned Paris into a perpetual party central.